Capitalism has brought us such a long way in the last 100 years. It's quintupled global GDP since the 1960s. It's eliminated so much extreme poverty. What have been the major shortcomings despite how far we've come?
I think largely I would say it's just been how that growth has happened in two ways. First, the growth hasn't been equal. It's been anything but equal. And so obviously GDP has marched, pretty aggressively upwards, but you've only got to take a look at what they call the majority world to see that it's massive gaps in terms of global GDP. So that's one thing in that it seems that there's a little bit of a zero-sum game going on at the moment in terms of capitalism, that as you got one end of the globe getting richer, it seems to have meant that other parts of the globe have had to give up, what would be kind of what you'd expect to be basic levels of living. Specific to what you say about millions being lifted out of poverty, those numbers are interesting. They're true. I'd say the number is probably in around bang on a million. Sorry, a billion. Sorry, and then that's a good number to go with. However, probably around 75% of that number comes out of China, and so even then, there's nuances to the picture that you kind of have to dig into to really start to understand the dynamics at the root of all this. And so we all know what's happened in China, and yes, it's done well. But could we say that China has grown off the back of mainstream capitalism? Probably not. The kind of capitalism practiced it's really more a form of authoritarianism than anything else. Yeah. So there's nuances to those numbers that we've got to be careful about. And so, I would say the main thing is on the inequality, and then how we've grown, which is to say how we've treated resources as we've done this expansion. Everything except the almighty dollar, if you like, seems to have taken the front foot. And so what you have is a system that's driven primarily by profit, and we haven't been able to measure the externalities that have then taken place over the last, say, century or so. I mean, if you look at the rainforest, for instance, and the recessions that have happened in just the span of the rainforest, it's massive. It's, if you were actually to calculate that and put that into your assessment of how a company was doing, most companies would be running at a loss. And the problem is being able to actually quantify the externalities of mainstream capitalistic activity has just escaped us. And so it's the analogy I like to use is, if we're an athlete, we've been an athlete running on steroids. And so, yes, you can break the 9-second barrier maybe, but what is it taking to get there? Is it a fair assessment to say that capitalism has done great things? Yes, but we can't say that without the context of all of what it's taken. And I think on the balance, society is basically now saying, enough is enough. We need to look at the whole of what's going on here and start thinking about what else we could be doing.
Yeah, interestingly, I think it takes a revolution in accounting and how we measure the negative externalities produced by business, because right now, like quarterly reports, annual reports, they don't take into account anything about externalities, about impact on the environment. I think we're starting to see that change with the introduction of ESG and this trend. But it's going to take a pretty major revolution in accounting to, I think, open the eyes of many executives. Who would you say, specifically in the West, capitalism and globalism has left behind?
Specifically in the West?
Yeah.
Well, you'd have to look at certainly the immigrant population. Parts of the West that have high immigrant populations. You have to say that that's certainly been the case, where when you're coming in and you don't have the advantages of wealth, it can be harder to close the gap. It's not impossible. There are lots of immigrants that have done really well. So obviously, it's a generalization. We'd obviously have to talk about, Black Americans and indigenous groups in countries like the US, but other countries, certainly in South America and Latin America. We see that we haven't been able to close the gaps that you would have kind of thought at the beginning of the 19th century, what you'd expected would have happened in South America, in the US, hasn't panned out. There have been green shoots at different points within the century, but what we've kind of seen is over the 70s and the 80s, there's been this inflection point towards more and more laissez-faire capitalism. The market will equalize, the market will solve these problems, and what you've seen is these wealth gaps have continued to expand. So those, I would say, those are the major groups that come to mind.
Yeah, I'll just add into the mix also blue collar workers in the States. I think that's a big reason why Donald Trump got elected at the end of the day, was so many blue collar jobs being shipped out to China. And then, places like Detroit just got absolutely decimated. And unfortunately, you get politicians like Hillary Clinton who won't sympathize, I guess, with their situation and call them the deplorables. Yeah.
And so that's the latest trend, and that's really a 15 to 20 year trend. But that's what it's taken. It's taken the issue to actually start to affect those who previously had power, who previously had wealth, before we were able to get any kind of traction in terms of this conversation. That's, if that hadn't happened, we likely still wouldn't be having this conversation. But in the aftermath of jobs going offshore in the US and other countries, and that sort of former lower middle class being quite hard hit, all of a sudden there's a credibility to the idea that we need to look at our economics again. Having said that, I'm not sure that that group in particular is looking at quote unquote economics for answers. I think there seems to be a trend. I'd say this is probably a global trend. And I know I've said that people are more open to have conversations about capitalism, but there seems to be still be a trend of looking for sort of someone to hang, sort of a witch hunt that seems to go on, where and the inverse of that is to look for someone to save us, right? And so the blue collar workers in the US, for instance, looked, Hillary Clinton is the establishment, and that's who we're going to hang, because whatever it is that they've done, it hasn't worked, and Trump is going to come save us. And to me, that is kind of lost the point of it all. And as long as we continue to think of politics and economics that way, I think we're going to struggle. The system is what's problematic, and it's a systemic problem. And it really, really doesn't matter so much who's in charge, unless there are pretty deep, what's the right word to use, changes to how we think about ownership, how we think about capital, who should own, how we think about how we treat assets that ultimately employ people and employ the environment in creating goods and services. And so there's some deep thinking to do there, and we've got to start doing that and spend less time counseling people online and that sort of thing.
Unfortunately, I don't think that trend is going to disappear anytime soon.
No, you're probably right.